Sometimes the smallest acts of mercy can mend the deepest wounds. Sometimes the most broken among us are the ones who end up saving someone else. In a dusty western town where people had stopped looking out for one another, a lone cowboy named Amos Briggs found a wooden crate abandoned on the dirt road. Inside was a trembling puppy, beaten and scared, with a heartbreaking sign nailed to the box. "Don't want her." Amos hadn't opened his heart to anyone since the fire took his wife and child years before. He'd become a shadow, just drifting through his days. But something about that little dog, her quiet suffering, her will to survive, touched a place in him he thought was long dead. What Amos did next would change everything. Would this unwanted puppy become the unlikely bridge that brings a grieving man back to life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Redemption Flats wasn't much to look at, even by territorial standards. The town squatted in a basin of scrubland where the earth cracked under an unforgiving sun, and the wind carried grit that found its way into everything. Your coffee, your bedroll, the creases around your eyes. The buildings hunched low and weathered, their adobe walls the same faded tan as the dirt they rose from. It was the kind of place people passed through on their way to somewhere better, or where they ended up when better wasn't in the cards anymore. The town had maybe 200 souls on a good day, spread between the main street and the handful of properties that radiated outward like spokes on a broken wheel. There was Henderson's livery stable, the largest building in town, which also served as the stagecoach stop. Next to it stood the general store run by the Nakamura family, who'd come west after the war and stayed because they'd found the kind of peace that didn't ask questions about where you came from. Doc Winters kept an office above the store, treating everything from snake bites to childbirths to the occasional bullet wound. Though those had grown rarer as the town aged into itself. The Golden Sage Saloon occupied the corner where the main road bent toward the creek. It wasn't golden, and sage didn't grow within 10 miles. But Maggie Chen had inherited the name, along with the deed when her husband died of pneumonia 5 winters back. She kept it running with quiet efficiency, serving decent whiskey and better stew, maintaining a place where men could drink without getting stupid about it. She had a way of looking at you that suggested she'd seen worse than whatever you were carrying, and somehow that made folks behave themselves. Sheriff Tom Braddock's office sat across from the saloon, a strategic position he claimed let him keep an eye on things. Tom was pushing 60, with a belly that spoke of Maggie's cooking, and a face that had seen enough of life's cruelties to have earned its deep lines honestly. His deputy, Jesse Martinez, was barely 22, earnest as a new penny and twice as bright. The boy had something to prove, having grown up the son of a Mexican mother and an Irish father who died before Jesse could remember him. Tom saw potential in the young man, and more importantly, saw himself 30 years back, eager, uncertain, and needing someone to believe in him. In the center of it all stood the church, a simple structure with a cross that caught the morning light. Reverend Phillips held services twice a week for those inclined toward redemption of the spiritual sort. He was a soft-spoken man who'd lost his own wife to cholera and understood that some griefs ran too deep for easy platitudes. And then there was Amos Briggs. Amos lived in a cabin about a quarter-mile outside town, far enough to avoid daily contact, but close enough that people knew he was still breathing. He worked at Henderson's livery, had for the past decade, doing the kind of labor that required more back than conversation. Mucking stalls, hauling feed, repairing tack, shoeing horses when Henderson's arthritis flared up. He was 58 years old, but carried himself like a man older, movements careful and measured, as if he'd learned not to disturb the air too much around him. He'd been handsome once. You could still see it in the structure of his face. Strong jaw, straight nose, eyes that were a startling blue against his sun-weathered skin. His hair had gone mostly grey, kept short beneath the battered hat he wore from dawn to dusk. He stood just over 6 feet, still had the broad shoulders of a man who'd spent his life working with his hands. But there was a hollowness to him now, like something essential had been carved out and never filled back in. 10 years ago, Amos Briggs had been a different man entirely. He'd had a wife then, Sarah, with her quick laugh and gentle hands, who could make a home out of nothing but love and determination. She'd been the daughter of a shopkeeper in Santa Fe, educated enough to read poetry and practical enough to birth a calf. She'd seen something in the quiet cowboy who'd wandered into her father's store, and she'd decided he was worth keeping. They'd married within 6 months, and Amos had never questioned his good fortune, only accepted it with the humble gratitude of a man who knew he'd been given more than he deserved. Their daughter Emily had arrived 2 years later, all dark curls and her mother's eyes, chattering from the moment she learned to form words. She'd been 8 years old when it happened, old enough to have a personality that filled a room, young enough to still believe her father could fix anything. The fire had started on a September evening, while Amos was away on a cattle drive, helping Henderson move stock to winter pasture. A neighbor had seen the flames, tried to get inside, but the heat drove him back. By the time enough men gathered to fight it, the adobe cabin was an inferno. They'd found Sarah and Emily in what had been their bedroom, overcome by smoke before the flames reached them. The neighbor said Sarah had been covering Emily with her own body, trying to protect her daughter until the very end. They'd buried them on a Thursday. Amos had stood at the graveside holding Sarah's silver locket, the one he'd given her on their wedding day. The one that held a tiny photograph of the 3 of them taken at a traveling photographer's studio. He'd stood there until everyone else had left, until the sun set and Sheriff Braddock gently took his arm and led him away. The investigation had been brief. A lamp knocked over, they'd said. Accident. These things happened in houses lit by flame and heated by wood stoves. No one was at fault. Just one of those tragedies that reminded you how fragile everything really was. Amos had stopped talking much after that. Oh, he could speak when he had to, answered direct questions, said please and thank you, conducted the basic business of staying alive. But the easy conversation, the casual warmth he'd once shared freely, that died with his family. He moved through his days like a man underwater, everything muffled and distant. He kept the locket, wore it on a chain beneath his shirt where no one could see it, where it rested against his heart like a stone. Some nights, when the whiskey wasn't enough to grant him sleep, he'd take it out and open it, studying those captured faces by lamplight. Sarah's smile, Emily's gap-toothed grin, his own younger face, still full of hope and possibility. Those nights, he'd wonder if it was his fault, if he should have been there. If he'd built the cabin better, maintained the lamps more carefully, if he'd just not taken that job driving Henderson's cattle, the spiral always ended the same way. With him closing the locket, setting it carefully on the small table beside his bed, and lying down to stare at the ceiling until exhaustion claimed him. The people of Redemption Flats had tried, at first, to pull him back into the world. Maggie Chen had brought meals until he'd quietly asked her to stop, not unkindly, just unable to bear the kindness. Doc Winters had checked on him weekly, until Amos assured him he wasn't going to do anything foolish. Sheriff Braddock had invited him to dinner so many times he'd finally stopped asking, settling instead for the occasional shared drink at the Golden Sage. 2 men sitting in companionable silence, because sometimes that was all you could offer. Henderson had given him the stable job, kept him on even when Amos's productivity dropped to half what it had been. The old man understood that work was the only thing keeping Amos tethered to the living world, and he wasn't about to cut that line. The town had eventually accepted what Amos had become. They nodded to him in the street, respected his silence, and worried about him in the quiet way of people who'd seen enough loss to recognize a man slowly disappearing into his own grief. Every evening, Amos would finish his work at the stable, walk the dusty road to his cabin, and sit on the porch with a tin cup of whiskey. Not enough to get drunk. He wasn't trying to escape, just to dull the edges enough to make it through another night. He'd watch the sunset over the scrubland, painting the sky in colors Sarah had loved, oranges and purples, and that particular shade of pink she'd called blessing light. Then he'd go inside, eat something simple if he remembered, and eventually lie down in a bed that felt too big and too empty. He'd touch the locket one more time, and sometimes, not every night but often enough, he'd whisper into the darkness, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." And the darkness never answered back. This had been his life for 10 years. Not living exactly, but not quite dying either. Existing in the grey space between, going through motions that had long since lost their meaning. He'd forgotten what joy felt like, what purpose tasted like. He'd become a ghost haunting his own life, and he'd made a kind of peace with it. Henderson had noticed it getting worse lately. The way Amos's hands had developed a slight tremor, how he'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, how his eyes had taken on a distant quality that suggested he was looking at something the rest of them couldn't see. The old livery owner had mentioned it to Sheriff Braddock over coffee one morning, his weathered face creased with concern. "I'm worried about him. Tom, I think he's letting go." Braddock had nodded slowly, knowing exactly what Henderson meant. They'd both seen men do it before, make that quiet decision to stop fighting, to just let the current carry them away. "I'll talk to him," Braddock had promised, though they both knew talking probably wouldn't help. Amos Briggs had built walls around his grief so high and thick that no words seemed able to scale them. But sometimes life has other plans. Sometimes salvation comes from unexpected places, in forms you'd never think to pray for. Sometimes it comes in a wooden crate, broken and unwanted, left in the dirt like trash. On this particular morning, a Tuesday in late April, when the air already shimmered with heat despite the early hour, Amos Briggs walked the familiar path from his cabin to Henderson's livery. His boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each step. The town was just waking up, smoke rising from morning cookfires, the sound of a rooster somewhere announcing the day with more enthusiasm than it deserved. Amos's mind was on nothing in particular, which was how he preferred it. Empty thoughts meant no memories, and no memories meant no pain. He'd gotten good at this over the years, the art of thinking about nothing at all. He rounded the bend where the road widened toward the stable, already reaching for the worn leather gloves in his back pocket, and that's when he saw it. A wooden crate sitting in the middle of the road, rough-hewn and weather-stained. At first, he thought someone had dropped freight from the morning stage. But the stage didn't come through until afternoon, and something about the way the crate sat there, alone, deliberately placed, made him slow his steps. He almost walked around it, almost kept going, because whatever was in that box wasn't his problem, and he'd learned that problems were easier to avoid than to solve. But then he heard it, a sound so soft he might have missed it if the morning hadn't been so still, a whimper. Small and frightened and somehow heartbreaking in its quietness, as if whatever made the sound had learned not to expect anyone to answer. Amos stopped walking. He stood there in the empty road, dust settling around his boots, staring at that crate, and despite every instinct that told him to keep moving, to maintain the safe distance he'd built between himself and the world, he took a step forward, then another. When he reached the crate and looked inside, something cracked in the fortress walls around his heart, because sometimes even the most broken souls can recognize each other, and sometimes recognizing each other is the first step toward becoming whole again. The puppy was small, maybe 8 or 10 weeks old, curled in the corner of the crate like she was trying to make herself disappear. Her fur was matted with dirt and dried blood, patches of it missing where someone had, Amos felt his jaw tighten, where someone had hurt her deliberately. She had cuts along her ribs, and one eye was swollen nearly shut. She trembled violently, whether from fear or pain or both. Amos couldn't tell, but it was the sign that made something hot and sharp twist in his chest, nailed to the side of the crate, painted in crude black letters that spoke of both cruelty and cowardice. Were 3 words, "Don't want her." Amos crouched down slowly, not wanting to scare her further. The puppy watched him with her one good eye, and in that dark, frightened gaze he saw something he recognized. the look of a creature that had learned the world was full of pain, and that expecting anything else was foolish. "Easy now," he heard himself say, his voice rough from disuse, but gentle in a way it hadn't been for a long time. "I'm not going to hurt you." The puppy didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe, just watched him with that terrible, knowing fear. Amos reached out slowly, letting her see his hand, giving her time to understand he meant no harm. When his fingers finally touched her head, she flinched but didn't pull away. Maybe she was too hurt to move. Maybe she'd given up hoping for anything better, or maybe, and this thought struck him with unexpected force, maybe she recognized something in him too. Another creature that had learned to expect nothing good from the world. The puppy's fur was soft beneath the dirt and blood. Amos could feel her small heart racing beneath his palm like a trapped bird. She made that sound again, that quiet whimper, and something in Amos's chest that had been frozen solid for 10 years began, just barely, to thaw. He thought of Sarah, how she'd always brought home strays, injured birds, orphaned kittens, once even a fox with a broken leg. She'd nursed them back to health in their kitchen, crooning to them in that soft voice, while Emily watched with wide, wondering eyes. "Everything deserves a chance, Amos," she'd tell him. "Everything deserves someone to care." The memory hurt like a physical wound, sharp enough to make him catch his breath. But beneath the pain was something else, something that felt almost like Sarah's hand on his shoulder, her voice in his ear saying what he knew she'd say if she were here. "Don't you dare walk away from her." Amos looked at the puppy, at this small, broken thing that someone had literally thrown away, and made a decision he didn't fully understand. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's get you some help." He lifted the crate carefully, mindful of the puppy's injuries. She whimpered again, but didn't struggle. The weight was nothing, but carrying it felt like the heaviest thing he'd done in years. Each step toward Doc Winters's office felt like a choice, a commitment, a step away from the comfortable numbness he'd wrapped around himself. The town was more awake now. Mrs. Nakamura was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the general store. She looked up, saw Amos carrying the crate, and her hand went to her mouth. Even from a distance she could see the sign. "Amos," she called softly. "Is that dog?" he said shortly. "Hurt. Need to see Doc." She nodded, understanding flooding her kind face. "I'll let him know you're coming." Doc Winters was waiting at the top of the stairs by the time Amos arrived, Mrs. Nakamura having run ahead. The doctor was in his middle 60s, white-haired and steady-handed, with the kind of face that inspired confidence. He'd patched up Amos after the fire, treated the burns Amos had gotten trying to run into the burning cabin before neighbors pulled him back. He'd checked on Amos's physical health regularly ever since, even though they both knew the real wounds went deeper than medicine could reach. "Let me see," Doc said, gesturing Amos inside and clearing his examination table. "Set her down gentle." Amos lowered the crate and Doc peered inside. His expression darkened as he assessed the puppy's condition. He made a low sound in his throat that might have been anger or sorrow or both. Who would do this to a defenseless animal? Doc muttered, more to himself than to Amos. Then louder, "Help me get her out, slowly. She's going to be scared." Together they lifted the puppy from the crate. She barely resisted, which worried Doc more than if she'd struggled. Animals that stopped fighting were often too far gone. He laid her carefully on a blanket on the table and began his examination, hands moving with practiced gentleness. Amos stood back, watching. He should have felt nothing. He'd trained himself not to feel much of anything anymore. But he found his hands clenched into fists, found himself holding his breath as Doc probed the puppy's injuries. "Multiple lacerations," Doc said quietly, falling into the clinical narration that helped him focus. "Looks like she was beaten with something. Maybe a stick or a belt. Malnourished. Probably hadn't been fed properly in days. Maybe weeks. Dehydrated. This eye." He touched the swollen socket gently. "And the puppy whined. Might have permanent damage, but I won't know for sure until the swelling goes down. Will she live?" Amos asked, and was surprised by how much the answer mattered. Doc looked up, studying Amos's face with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to read people as well as symptoms. Something passed across his features, recognition maybe, or hope, with proper care. Yes, she's young and the young are resilient, but she needs medicine for infection, regular feeding, a warm place to rest and, he paused meaningfully, someone to look after her. Check her wounds daily, make sure she eats and drinks, keep her quiet while she heals. They both knew what he was really asking. Amos looked down at the puppy. Her one good eye watched him with that same wary hopefulness. In the better light of Doc's office, he could see she was probably some mix of shepherd and maybe hound, with a brown and white coat beneath the filth. She'd be a medium-sized dog when grown, if she got the chance to grow. I'll take her, Amos heard himself say. The words hung in the air. Doc's eyebrows rose slightly. You'll need to... I know, Amos interrupted. Check her wounds. Feed her, keep her warm. I understand. It's a responsibility, Amos. She'll need more than just basic care. She needs... Doc searched for the right word. She needs someone to care about her, to help her learn to trust again. I know, Amos repeated, softer this time. Something in his tone made Doc nod slowly. He turned back to the puppy and began cleaning her wounds with warm water and carbolic solution. The puppy whimpered but didn't snap or try to escape. She seemed to understand, in whatever way animals understand such things, that this pain was different, that it was meant to help. Amos watched Doc work, applying salve, bandaging the worst cuts, examining the swollen eye more closely. The eye should heal, Doc concluded. But we'll need to keep it clean. I'm going to give you some medicine, powder to mix with her food for infection, salve for the wounds, and clean bandages. Change them daily. Bring her back in 3 days so I can check her progress. He prepared the medicines, explaining each one's use, writing instructions on a piece of paper in his precise handwriting. Then he paused, looking at Amos again with that assessing gaze. There's the matter of payment, Doc said carefully. Amos reached for his pocket, but Doc raised a hand. I don't want your money, Amos. He pulled out a sheet of paper and wrote something across it, then handed it to Amos. Here's your receipt. Amos looked down at the paper. In Doc's neat script it read, Veterinary Services Rendered, paid in full. And beneath that, in smaller letters, for Sarah, Amos's throat went tight. He tried to speak, couldn't, just nodded once sharply. She loved animals, Doc said quietly. She'd have wanted you to help this one? I know, Amos managed. Henderson appeared at the door. Having heard from Mrs. Nakamura, the old livery owner took in the scene, the puppy on the table, the medicines Amos's face. She needs somewhere to stay, Henderson asked. I got clean straw at the stable, quiet stall in the back. Cabin, Amos said. She'll stay with me. Henderson's weathered face showed surprise, then something that might have been relief. I'll bring by some blankets. And I got beef scraps from last night's supper. If she needs feeding, thank you, Amos said. And meant it. Doc finished wrapping the last bandage, then carefully lifted the puppy and placed her back in the crate, this time on a clean blanket he'd folded at the bottom. She settled into it with a small sigh, exhausted from the handling. Keep her quiet and warm, Doc instructed. Feed her small amounts frequently. She hasn't been eating regularly, so we need to be gentle with her stomach. Clean water always available. And Amos, he met his eyes directly, talk to her. Let her hear your voice. Help her remember that humans aren't all cruel. Amos nodded, taking the crate carefully. The puppy looked up at him with that one good eye, and something passed between them. An understanding, perhaps. An acknowledgement that they were both broken things, both thrown away in their own fashion, both unsure if healing was even possible, but maybe, just maybe, they could figure it out together. As Amos carried the crate down the stairs and toward his cabin, the morning sun warm on his back, he felt the weight of the locket against his chest. And instead of the usual crushing guilt, he felt something different. He felt Sarah's approval, as clear as if she'd spoken aloud. And for the first time in 10 years, Amos Briggs thought that maybe, just possibly, he might be worth saving after all. Behind him, Doc Winters watched from his window. He saw Amos's straight back, the careful way he held that crate. The slight change in his walk that suggested purpose instead of routine. "Well, Sarah," Doc murmured to the memory of a woman he'd respected deeply, "I think you just sent him exactly what he needed." And in the warmth of the morning light, it almost felt like she heard him. The first night was the hardest. Amos set up a bed for the puppy near the small stove in his cabin, blankets Henderson had brought, arranged in a nest that would keep her warm without being confining. He'd given her small amounts of milk-soaked bread, which she'd eaten hesitantly, and fresh water which she'd lapped at with desperate thirst. Then he'd applied the salve to her wounds as Doc had shown him, his large hands surprisingly gentle as the puppy trembled beneath his touch. When darkness fell and he climbed into his own bed, Amos expected to sleep as he always did, fitfully, haunted by memories and what-ifs. Instead, he found himself listening. The puppy whimpered softly in the darkness. Not constantly, just occasional small sounds that spoke of pain and fear and profound loneliness. Each sound pulled at something in Amos's chest, something he'd thought long dead. After the fourth whimper, he gave up on sleep. He rose, lit the lamp low, and moved to sit on the floor beside her makeshift bed. The puppy's good eye opened, watching him warily. "I know," Amos said quietly. "I know it hurts." He reached out slowly, and after a moment's hesitation, she allowed his hand to rest on her head. Her fur was cleaner now after Doc's ministrations, soft beneath his palm. He could feel her trembling. "I'm not much good at this," Amos continued, his voice low and rough. "Haven't taken care of anyone in a long time. Haven't wanted to, truth be told." The puppy made a small sound, and Amos found himself talking, really talking, for the first time in years. The words came haltingly at first, then easier, like water finally flowing through a long-blocked pipe. He told her about Sarah, about how she'd lit up a room just by entering it, how her laugh had been the best sound he'd ever known. He told her about Emily, about the way his daughter had loved stories, how she'd make him read the same book over and over until he had it memorized. He told her about the fire, about the guilt that had eaten at him like acid for 10 years, about how he'd wondered every single day if he could have prevented it somehow. The puppy listened with that unwavering attention animals have, her eye fixed on his face. And something about speaking these things aloud to this small, wounded creature made them feel less impossible to bear. She didn't judge him, didn't tell him to move on or that time heals all wounds. She just listened, present in a way humans often failed to be. "Doc says you'll heal," Amos said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Says you're young enough, strong enough. I hope he's right. I hope—" He paused, surprised by what he was about to say. "I hope I can help you do that." The puppy sighed, a long, shuddering breath, and slowly, her trembling eased. She leaned her head against his hand, a gesture of trust so profound it made Amos's throat go tight. He stayed there on the floor until she fell asleep, his hand resting gently on her side, feeling the rise and fall of her breathing. When he finally returned to his bed, he slept more soundly than he had in months. The days took on a new rhythm after that. Amos would wake before dawn, check on the puppy, feed her small portions of soaked bread or the meat scraps Henderson brought. He'd clean her wounds with the careful attention Doc had taught him, apply fresh salve and bandages, talk to her while he worked. Then he'd head to the livery, but where before he'd lost himself in the mindless routine, now he found himself hurrying through tasks, eager to get back to the cabin. It surprised him, this eagerness, this sense of something waiting for him at home besides emptiness and memories. The puppy grew stronger daily. By the third day she could stand without swaying. By the fifth, she was following him around the small cabin with tentative steps, staying close to his heels like a shadow. The swelling around her eye decreased, and Doc confirmed what he'd hoped, no permanent damage. Both eyes would work fine once the healing was complete, but Amos struggled with one thing, her name. He'd tried not to name her at first. Names made things permanent, made them real in a way that felt dangerous. If he named her, he was admitting she mattered, and if she mattered, she could be taken away. could leave him alone again in the particular way that losing something you'd allowed yourself to care about created, but calling her pup or girl felt wrong somehow. She deserved better than that. He was sitting on his porch one evening, the puppy at his feet, watching the sun set in that particular way Sarah had loved, when Sheriff Braddock rode up. The lawman dismounted slowly, his movements showing his age, and nodded to Amos. "Heard you took in a stray," Braddock said. His voice, carrying its usual dry warmth, seemed like the thing to do. Braddock settled onto the porch rail, looking down at the puppy. She looked back at him calmly, no longer cowering from strangers. "She looks better than Doc described." "You've done good work here, Amos." Amos shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "You give her a name yet?" "No," Braddock was quiet for a moment. Sarah would have named her by now. The words weren't meant to hurt, Amos knew. They were just truth, spoken plain. Sarah would have named her within an hour of bringing her home. "I know," Amos said quietly. "Can't keep calling her the puppy forever." "I know that too." Braddock studied him, then nodded and changed the subject. They talked about the weather, about Henderson's plans to expand the stable, about Jesse Martinez's progress as a deputy. Easy conversation between men who'd known each other long enough not to fill every silence. After Braddock left, Amos sat in the growing darkness with the puppy curled against his leg. He thought about names, about permanence, about the risk of caring. That night he dreamed of Sarah, not the usual nightmares where he was running toward the burning cabin but could never reach it. This time, she was sitting in their old kitchen, sunlight streaming through the window, that smile on her face that had always made his heart skip. "What are you afraid of?" she asked, her voice as clear as if she stood beside him. "Losing someone again," he answered. "Oh, my love," she said, her smile turning sad and wise. "You're already losing yourself. Maybe it's time to risk something different." He woke with her name on his lips, not Sarah, but her middle name, Hope, Sarah Hope Briggs. She'd always said hope was the most important thing a person could carry. Even in hard times, especially in hard times, you needed hope to keep going. The puppy was watching him from her bed, both eyes now open and clear, her tail wagging slightly at seeing him awake. "Hope," Amos said aloud. Testing the word, the puppy's tail wagged harder. Whether she understood the word itself or just the tone in his voice, Amos couldn't say. But it felt right in a way few things had felt right in a very long time. "Your name is Hope," he said, more firmly now. She stood, stretched, and walked to him, pressing her nose against his hand. And Amos felt something shift inside him, not the grief disappearing, but making room for something else alongside it. He'd spent the morning of that day working at the livery, and during his lunch break he'd found himself in Henderson's workshop, looking at the scraps of wood stored there. Good oak, seasoned and smooth. Without quite planning to, he'd selected a piece and asked Henderson if he minded. "Help yourself," the old man had said, his eyes knowing. "Good to see you working with your hands on something besides tack." Amos had brought the wood home, and in the evenings after caring for Hope he began to carve. It had been years since he'd done any woodwork. He used to make toys for Emily, small horses and dolls, and once an entire miniature barn that had been her favorite possession. His hands remembered the movements, even if his heart had forgotten the pleasure of creating. He carved carefully, letting the bowl take shape over several evenings. Hope would sit beside him, watching the wood shavings fall, occasionally sniffing at them with curious interest. He made the bowl wider than necessary, deep enough to hold plenty of water, with a smooth interior that would be easy to clean. He carved her name along the outside in simple letters, taking his time to get each curve right. When it was finished, he sanded it until it was smooth as glass, then treated it with oil to protect the wood. The act of making something, of creating rather than just maintaining or enduring, felt like waking up after a long sleep. His hands moved with purpose, his mind focused on the work rather than circling the same dark thoughts that had occupied it for years. On the evening he finished, Amos filled the bowl with fresh water and placed it on the floor. Hope approached it cautiously, sniffed it, then looked up at him as if seeking permission. "It's yours," Amos said softly. She drank deeply, water splashing slightly as her tail wagged. When she finished, she licked his hand, not the hesitant touch of those first days, but a confident gesture of affection and trust. Amos knelt beside her, running his hand over her head, feeling the healthy shine returning to her coat. She leaned into his touch, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a decade. He felt needed. He felt useful. He felt, just barely, like maybe he was someone worth being again. That night, for the first time since the fire, Amos took out Sarah's locket and looked at it without the crushing weight of guilt. The faces in the photograph still hurt to see. They probably always would. But underneath the pain was something new, gratitude for the years he'd had them, for the love they'd shared, and maybe, just maybe, for this second chance at having something to care for, something to protect, something to love. Hope slept peacefully in her bed, both eyes closed, her breathing deep and even. The wounds on her body were healing, pink new skin showing beneath the bandages. She'd gained weight, her ribs no longer quite so visible. In another week or two, she'd be completely recovered, at least physically, and watching her sleep. Amos realized something that would have terrified him just weeks before. Her healing was helping him heal too. He didn't know if he deserved this second chance. Didn't know if saving one small dog could somehow balance the scales of all he'd failed to protect. But Hope didn't care about deserving. She just cared that he'd chosen to try. And maybe, Amos thought, closing the locket gently and setting it aside, maybe that was enough to build on. 3 weeks after finding Hope in that wooden crate, Amos stood in front of the small mirror in his cabin and barely recognized the man looking back at him. Not because he'd changed dramatically. The same weathered face, the same gray hair, the same blue eyes. But there was something different in those eyes now. A spark of life that had been absent for so long he'd forgotten what it looked like. Hope sat at his feet, tail wagging, watching him with bright, alert eyes. Both were fully healed now, and she'd filled out into a handsome young dog with intelligent features and a coat that shone with health. She followed him everywhere, a constant presence that had somehow become essential to his daily existence. "What do you think, girl?" Amos asked, adjusting his collar. "Presentable enough?" Hope barked once, a sound of pure enthusiasm, and Amos found himself smiling, actual smiling. When had that become possible again? Henderson had asked him, not ordered but genuinely asked, if he'd consider working with the young horses again. Before the fire, Amos had been known throughout the territory as someone with a gift for training. He had a calm, patient way with animals that brought out the best in them. But after Sarah and Emily died, he'd refused to do that kind of work anymore. It required too much attention, too much care, too much investment of himself. He'd retreated to the mindless labor of mucking and hauling, but something had shifted. Maybe it was Hope's trust in him, the way she'd healed under his care. Maybe it was the simple fact of having a reason to get up in the morning, beyond just continuing to breathe. Whatever the cause, when Henderson asked, Amos had surprised himself by saying yes. The work came back to him like a language he'd spoken as a child, rusty at first, but quickly flowing. He spent mornings at the livery now, working with a young bay mare that had been skittish and uncooperative. Within days, she was responding to his quiet commands, her fear transforming into trust. Hope accompanied him to the livery each day, becoming a fixture around the stable. The horses seemed to find her presence calming, and Henderson joked that she was the best assistant he'd ever had. But it was the effect on the town that surprised Amos most. Children, who'd learned to give him wide berth over the years, were drawn to Hope like iron to a magnet. They'd ask shyly if they could pet her, and Hope, gentle soul that she was, would accept their affection with patient grace, tail wagging. Occasionally, licking a small hand or face, Amos found himself talking to these children, answering their questions about how to treat a dog properly, how to read an animal's body language. Simple conversations, but they chipped away at the walls he'd built. Brick by brick, there was one girl in particular, maybe 7 years old, with dark curls that reminded him painfully of Emily. Her name was Clara, daughter of the blacksmith, and she seemed to have adopted Hope as her special friend. She'd bring scraps from her family's dinner, always asking Amos's permission first, and she'd sit in the stable telling Hope elaborate stories about her day. Watching her, Amos felt the familiar ache of loss. But beneath it was something new, not a replacement for Emily, never that, but perhaps permission to remember her with something other than pure grief. Clara's joy in Hope's company reminded him that life continued, that children still laughed and played and loved, and that maybe that was okay. Maggie Chen had noticed the change too. She'd stopped by the livery one afternoon, ostensibly to discuss an order with Henderson, but Amos saw how her eyes found him, assessed him with that careful, knowing gaze she had. "You look better," she said directly, catching him as he was finishing with the bay mare. More alive. Amos felt heat rise to his face, unaccustomed to such direct observation. "The dog's been good for me." "More than the dog, I think," Maggie said, but her tone was gentle. "You're letting people back in. That takes courage." "Didn't feel like courage. Felt more like I didn't have the energy to keep them out anymore." Maggie smiled, an expression that softened her usually stern features. "However it happened, I'm glad. This town needs you, Amos Briggs. Needs your wisdom, your steadiness. We've missed you." The words settled over him like a warm blanket. He'd thought himself forgotten, written off as a lost cause. But Maggie's words suggested otherwise. Suggested he'd been missed, waited for, hoped for. Before he could respond, Hope trotted over, and Maggie crouched to greet her. "And you, little one, you're quite the miracle worker." Hope's tail wagged furiously, and Amos felt a swell of something that might have been pride. His dog, healthy and happy and loved. That evening, a cold snap moved through, unusual for late spring but not unheard of in the high desert. Amos built up the fire in his stove, but Hope still shivered slightly, her short coat not quite enough against the dropping temperature. He needed more blankets. He knew he had some stored away somewhere, things he'd packed up after the fire and never looked at again. The thought of opening that trunk, of facing those remnants of his former life, had been impossible for years, but Hope needed warmth. And Amos found that her needs could push him past barriers his own never could. The trunk sat in the corner of his small bedroom, covered with a canvas sheet dusty from years of neglect. Amos stood before it, his heart pounding harder than such a simple task warranted. Hope sat beside him, sensing his tension, pressing against his leg in silent support. "All right," Amos said quietly, as much to himself as to her. "Let's do this." He pulled off the canvas and opened the trunk. The smell hit him first, that particular scent of cedar and memories of a life lived and lost. Inside were the things he'd salvaged from the fire, the things he'd boxed away because seeing them was too much to bear. Sarah's dresses, carefully folded. Her favorite shawl, the blue one she'd worn on cool evenings. Her book of recipes, handwritten in her precise script. Emily's clothes, so small they seemed impossible. Had his daughter really been that tiny? Her toys, her little boots, her Sunday dress with the ribbons Sarah had sewn on, and at the bottom, Emily's rag doll. Amos lifted it with trembling hands. Sarah had made it, stitching it together from scraps of fabric during the long winter nights when Emily was just a baby. The doll had been Emily's constant companion, clutched in her small arms during bedtime, dragged everywhere despite Sarah's protests about getting it dirty. Emily had named it Rosie. She talked to it like it was real, had tea parties with it, tucked it in beside her each night. The doll was singed around the edges from the fire, but intact. Amos pressed it to his chest, and for the first time in years, he let himself cry, really cry, deep sobs that came from a place so dark and buried, he'd thought it sealed off forever. Hope whined softly, pushing her nose against his arm. He reached down, pulled her close with one arm while still clutching the doll with the other, and let the grief pour out of him. All the tears he'd been too numb to cry. All the pain he'd locked away because feeling it meant acknowledging the depth of his loss. But hope stayed pressed against him, warm and solid and real. And eventually, he didn't know how long it took, the sobs subsided into quiet tears, and those into steady breathing. He looked at the doll again. Really looked at it. Sarah's careful stitches, the love sewn into every seam. The joy it had brought Emily. Would they want these things locked away? Would Sarah approve of him hiding their belongings like shameful secrets? Or would she want them used, want their memory to bring warmth and comfort to something living? Hope shivered again, and Amos made a decision. From Sarah's dresses, he selected the ones too damaged by smoke to ever be worn again. He took Emily's smaller clothes, the ones that were singed or stained. With careful hands, he tore the fabric into strips and squares, then braided and stitched them together into a blanket. Not pretty, but functional and warm. As he worked, Hope watched with patient interest. The work took hours. His stitches nowhere near as fine as Sarah's would have been, but solid enough. He worked by lamplight, and as his hands moved, he talked, to Sarah, to Emily, to Hope, to himself. He told them about Hope's rescue, about how this wounded pup had somehow reached past his defenses. He told them about starting to feel again, about how scary and wonderful it was to care about something after so long. He asked their forgiveness for taking so long to come back to life. He asked their blessing to use these remnants of their existence to create something new. And in the quiet of his cabin, with Hope at his feet and his hands moving in the familiar rhythm of creation, Amos felt something he hadn't dared hope for: peace. Not the absence of grief, but the ability to hold grief and love in the same heart without being destroyed by either. When he finished, the blanket was far from perfect. Mismatched colors, uneven stitches, edges that didn't quite align. But it was warm and soft, and when he laid it in Hope's bed, she immediately climbed onto it, circling 3 times before settling down with a contented sigh. The fabric from Sarah's blue dress, the cloth from Emily's favorite nightgown. Hope slept on them without knowing their history, without carrying the weight of all they represented. And somehow that felt right. These things weren't relics to be preserved in the dark. They were pieces of people he'd loved, and using them to comfort something living felt like the best tribute he could offer. Amos sat on his bed, watching Hope sleep on her new blanket. Emily's doll sat beside him on the nightstand, and instead of putting it back in the trunk, he left it there. A reminder not of death, but of the life they'd shared. For the first time in 10 years, Amos slept through the night without nightmares. The next morning, he did something he'd been avoiding since the funeral. He saddled Henderson's gentlest horse, lifted Hope onto the saddle in front of him, and rode to the small cemetery on the hill outside town. Sarah and Emily's graves sat beneath a gnarled oak tree, the only tree for miles, its presence there almost miraculous. The headstones were simple but well-maintained. Sheriff Braddock had been keeping them clean, Amos realized, touched by the quiet kindness. He dismounted, lifting Hope down carefully. She stayed close to his leg as he approached the graves, sensing the solemnity of the moment. "Sarah," he said aloud, his voice steady. "Emily, I'm sorry it took me so long to come back. I'm sorry for a lot of things." He told them about Hope, about the carving and the blanket and the slow return to something like living. He told them about the work with the horses, about talking to children again, about Maggie's kind words. "I don't know if I deserve any of this," he said quietly. "Don't know if I deserve a second chance. But Hope needed me, and somehow that made me need her. And maybe," he paused, the words difficult but necessary, "maybe you both would want me to keep going, to find some kind of life again." Hope sat patiently beside him, her warmth against his leg, an anchor to the present, while he made peace with the past. "I'll always love you," Amos said, his voice breaking slightly. "Always carry you with me. But I think I'm ready to stop just existing and start living again. Hope you don't mind." The wind rustled through the oak tree's leaves, and in that sound, Amos heard his answer. Sarah's voice in memory. "Live, my love. Live for all of us." He stood there a while longer, Hope patient beside him, and when he finally left, he felt lighter. Not because the grief was gone. It would never be fully gone, but because he'd made his peace with carrying it while still moving forward. Riding back to town, hope secure in his arms, Amos Briggs felt something he hadn't felt in a decade. He felt ready for whatever came next. 2 months had passed since that morning when Amos found hope in the wooden crate, and Redemption Flats had slowly become something other than just a place he existed. It had become, once again, a community he was part of. Amos had gained back the weight he'd lost, color returning to his weathered face. He no longer walked with that defeated slump, shoulders curved inward like he was trying to make himself smaller. Instead, he stood straight, met people's eyes when they greeted him, even initiated conversations occasionally, brief ones, but genuine. He'd begun taking his evening meals at the boarding house twice a week, sitting at the long communal table where townspeople gathered. The conversations washed over and around him. Talk of crops and weather, gossip and news, the comfortable chatter of people who'd lived alongside each other long enough to know each other's rhythms. At first, he'd simply listened, but gradually he found himself contributing a comment here, an observation there. Hope was always at his side during these meals, lying quietly beneath the table. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the boarding house, had initially protested having a dog in her dining room, but Hope's impeccable manners and Amos's obvious attachment had won her over. Sheriff Braddock had become a regular dinner companion, their weekly shared drinks evolving into genuine friendship. They'd talk about everything and nothing. Braddock's concerns about maintaining order as the territory changed, Amos's observations about the horses he was training, shared memories of better times. On Sundays, Amos had even started attending church again. He sat in the back pew, Hope waiting patiently outside, and listened to Reverend Phillips's gentle sermons. He didn't know if he believed anymore. The fire had shaken his faith in any benevolent order to the universe, but there was comfort in the ritual, in being part of something larger than his own grief. The biggest change was his relationship with Jesse Martinez. The young deputy had started coming by the livery regularly, ostensibly to check on his horse, but really to learn from Amos. Jesse had grown up without a father, his mother working herself to exhaustion to support them, and he had that particular hunger for guidance that fatherless sons often carry. Amos found himself slipping into a mentoring role, almost without realizing it. He taught Jesse about reading horse behavior, about patience and training, about the kind of quiet confidence that made animals and people trust you. They'd work in comfortable silence, punctuated by Jesse's questions and Amos's measured responses. One evening, as they were finishing up at the stable, Jesse had said quietly, "You know, my pop died before I could remember him. Sometimes I wonder what he would have taught me if he'd lived." Amos had felt the weight of that statement, understanding what the young man wasn't quite saying. "Your mother did right by you. You're a good man, Jesse. Thanks to her, yeah." But Jesse paused, uncomfortable. "Having someone like you around, someone willing to teach me things, share their wisdom, it means something. Just wanted you to know that." Amos had nodded, not trusting his voice, feeling the particular ache of loss transformed into something purposeful. He couldn't be Emily's father anymore, but maybe he could be something like a father figure to this earnest young man who needed one. But despite this growing reintegration into community life, there were challenges emerging that would test everything Amos had. Rebuilt, it started with notices appearing around town one morning in early June, official-looking papers tacked to the board. Outside the general store, the saloon, the sheriff's office. Amos had been walking Hope when he noticed the crowd gathering, people reading the notices with expressions ranging from excitement to concern. The notice announced a town meeting for that evening. Subject: proposed railroad expansion through Redemption Flats, the railroad. The word itself carried weight in the territories, promise and threat in equal measure. It could bring prosperity, connection to the wider world, opportunities for growth. It could also bring change, upheaval, the loss of the quiet, self-determined life small towns valued. Amos stood reading the notice, Hope sitting patiently at his feet, and felt an unfamiliar stirring of concern. He'd spent so long focused inward that external events had seemed irrelevant. But now he had connections again, people he cared about, a community that mattered to him. What happened to Redemption Flats suddenly felt personal. Henderson found him there, the old livery owner's weathered face troubled. "You coming to the meeting tonight?" "Thinking about it." "Good. We'll need level heads. This railroad business, it's got people stirred up." Henderson paused, then added quietly, "Wouldn't mind having you there. Your opinion carries weight, whether you know it or not." That evening, Amos found himself walking toward the church, the only building large enough to hold a town meeting. Hope walked beside him, her presence steadying. He'd spent 10 years avoiding exactly this kind of community involvement, and part of him wanted to turn around, go back to his cabin, maintain the distance that felt safer, but another part, the part that Hope had somehow awakened, knew that being part of a community meant showing up, especially when things mattered. The church was packed, every pew filled, people standing along the walls, the air thick with body heat and nervous energy. Amos slipped into a spot near the back, Hope settling at his feet. He recognized almost everyone there, the accumulated faces of 10 years of peripheral existence. Now suddenly individuals he knew by name, by story, by shared history. Sheriff Braddock stood at the front with Reverend Phillips, calling the meeting to order. "Appreciate everyone coming out tonight. We've got a representative from the Denver and Santa Fe Railway Company here to discuss their proposal. I ask that we all listen respectfully, save our questions for after he's finished." The representative stepped forward, and Amos felt an immediate, instinctive distrust. The man was perhaps 40, wearing a suit too fine for the dusty reality of Redemption Flats, with slicked back hair and a smile that seemed practiced rather than genuine. Everything about him screamed Easterner, city man, someone who viewed places like this as opportunities rather than homes. "Good evening, folks. My name is Garrett Preston, and I'm the Regional Director of Expansion for the Denver and Santa Fe line." His voice was smooth, confident, the kind of voice accustomed to convincing people. "I'm here with what I believe is a wonderful opportunity for your community." He unfurled a large map, showing the proposed rail route. It would come up from Santa Fe, cut through Redemption Flats, and continue north toward Colorado. Preston talked about the benefits: regular freight service, passenger connections, economic growth, modernization. "Your town would become a regular stop on our line," Preston said, his smile wide. "Think about what that means. Regular supplies without waiting for wagon freight. Easy travel to cities. New businesses drawn by the rail access. Property values increasing. Jobs during construction and ongoing operation. Your children would have opportunities you never dreamed of." Amos watched the faces around him. Some lit up with excitement, younger folks mostly, those who felt constrained by the isolation of territorial life. Others looked worried, the older generation, those who remembered when the town was even smaller, who valued the quiet rhythms of life here. "Of course," Preston continued, "we'd need to acquire some land for the route. The station, the necessary infrastructure. We're prepared to make generous offers to affected property owners. Very generous. This is an opportunity that benefits everyone." Questions erupted once he finished. "What about the noise? The disruption during construction? Which properties would be affected? How much control would the railroad have over the town's development?" Preston answered smoothly, deflecting concerns, emphasizing benefits. But Amos noticed how his eyes would linger on certain faces, calculating, assessing. This was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. Henderson stood, his voice carrying the authority of age and respected position. "Mr. Preston, progress is well and good, but Redemption Flats has a character, a way of life. We're not looking to become some rough railroad town full of transients and trouble. How do we preserve what we value while accepting what you're offering?" Preston's smile didn't waver. "That's entirely up to your community, Mr. Henderson. The railroad simply provides access. What you do with it is your choice." But Amos heard the subtext. "We're coming regardless. The only question is whether you cooperate or resist. When the floor opened for general discussion, voices rose in debate. Some argued passionately for accepting the railroad. Opportunity was opportunity, and refusing progress was foolish. Others argued just as passionately for rejection. The town didn't need outsiders deciding its future, didn't need the kind of growth that destroyed what made a place worth living in. Amos sat quietly, listening, hope's weight against his leg grounding him. He'd planned to remain silent, but something about Preston's calculated smile, about the way he was manipulating the room's emotions, stirred something in him. He stood, and the room gradually quieted. People turned to look, surprise evident on their faces. Amos Briggs, the ghost who'd barely spoken 2 words in 10 years, was about to address the town meeting. "I don't claim to know what's best," Amos began, his voice rough but steady. "I've been absent for a long time, but I've been finding my way back recently, thanks to this community's patience and kindness." He paused, gathering his thoughts, aware of Preston's sharp attention focused on him. "My wife Sarah used to say that the important thing wasn't how much you had, but what you did with it. Whether you used what you had to build up or tear down, to help or harm." Amos looked around the room, meeting eyes that had watched him for years. "This town took care of me when I couldn't take care of myself. Gave me work when I wasn't worth much as a worker. Gave me space when I needed it, and patience when I couldn't reciprocate." His hand dropped to Hope's head, fingers finding the familiar comfort of her soft fur. "Now we've got a choice to make about our future. And I think the question isn't whether we accept progress or refuse it. It's whether we let progress happen to us or whether we shape it ourselves. Whether we maintain control of who we are while accepting what might improve our lives." Several heads nodded. Amos continued, feeling his way through thoughts he hadn't fully formed until he spoke them aloud. "Mr. Preston promises benefits, and maybe he's sincere. But we'd be fools to accept any arrangement that puts our town's future entirely in outside hands. If we do this, we do it on terms that protect what matters, our community, our values, our right to say no if things aren't working." He sat down, heart pounding harder than such a brief speech warranted. Hope leaned against him, and he felt the weight of attention, of consideration, of mattering in a way he hadn't allowed himself to matter in years. The discussion continued, but the tenor had shifted. People were talking now about conditions, about maintaining local control, about protecting Redemption Flat's character while accepting potential growth. Amos's words had given shape to concerns that had been floating formlessly. Preston's smile had thinned slightly, his eyes on Amos with a new assessment. This wasn't a ghost anymore. This was a man with influence, with respect, with the ability to sway opinion. The meeting ended without firm decision. This would require more discussion, more negotiation. But as people filed out, several stopped to thank Amos for speaking, to shake his hand, to tell him they'd been thinking exactly what he'd said, but couldn't find the words. Maggie Chen caught him at the door, her hand briefly touching his arm. "That was well said." Sarah would be proud. The words landed warm in his chest. "Just trying to figure out what she'd have wanted." "You're doing more than that," Maggie said quietly. "You're becoming who you need to be. For yourself, for this town. It's good to have you back, Amos." Walking home under the stars, Hope at his side, Amos felt the strange mix of emotions that came with re-entering the world. It was harder than isolation. Caring about things meant they could hurt you. But it was also richer, fuller, more real. He'd spoken at a town meeting. He'd offered an opinion that mattered to others. He'd stood up for something beyond his own grief. Sarah would have been proud. Emily would have been excited to hear about it. And Hope just trotted alongside him, content in the moment, teaching him by example that sometimes the best way forward is simply to keep walking, one step after another, trusting that the path will reveal itself. Behind them, in the town, Garrett Preston stood in the shadows outside the church, watching Amos disappear into the darkness. He pulled out a small notebook and wrote a name, Amos Briggs, potential obstacle. Some problems, Preston knew, could be handled with money. Others required more creative solutions. He smiled to himself, already planning his next moves. The railroad was coming to Redemption Flats, and anyone who stood in its way would learn to regret it. The days following the town meeting carried a tension that hadn't existed before. Garrett Preston had taken up residence at the boarding house, conducting private meetings with various landowners. His smooth voice and generous offers working through the community like water finding cracks in stone. Some families accepted his deals and made plans to leave. The Johnsons, whose ranch sat directly in the proposed rail path, sold within a week. The widow Thompson, struggling alone on her small homestead, took Preston's offer with visible relief. Each sale felt like a small victory for Preston and a small loss for those who wanted to preserve Redemption Flats as it was. Amos watched this unfold with growing unease. He'd spent so long disconnected from community concerns that he'd forgotten how vulnerable small towns were to outside pressure. How easily the fabric of a place could be torn when enough threads pulled loose. His training work with Jesse continued, but now their conversations often turned to the railroad situation. Jesse's young idealism warred with his practical understanding of how power worked. "Part of me thinks the railroad could be good," Jesse admitted one afternoon as they worked with a particularly stubborn gelding. "My mother could visit her sister in Santa Fe without it being a 3-day ordeal. People think they're getting a good deal, but I'd bet money the railroad ends up benefiting more than the town." Amos nodded, feeling the same instinct. He'd learned over his years as a marshal, a fact he'd shared with Jesse during one of their longer conversations, that the smoothest talkers were often the most dangerous. Men who led with charm usually had something to hide. It was during this period of uncertainty that Maggie Chen appeared at the livery one morning, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She found Amos brushing down the bay mare, Hope sleeping in a patch of sunlight nearby. "Amos," she greeted him, her usual brisk efficiency softened by something that looked like nervousness. Do you have a moment?" "Always have time for you, Maggie." She smiled at that, then held out the bundle. "I've been meaning to return this for 10 years now. Sarah lent it to me long before the fire. I'd asked her for some recipes, and she insisted I take the whole book, said to keep it as long as I needed. And then after," she paused, the painful memory hanging between them, "I didn't know how to give it back. Didn't want to cause you more pain. But recently, watching you come back to life, I thought maybe now you could have it." Amos took the bundle with careful hands, already knowing what it was before he unwrapped it. Sarah's recipe book. She'd kept it meticulously, each recipe written in her neat handwriting, some with notes in the margins. Amos's favorite, or "Emily asks for this every Sunday," or "needs more salt." He opened it slowly, and the smell hit him, paper and ink, and somehow, impossibly, a ghost of Sarah's perfume. His vision blurred, and he blinked rapidly, thumb tracing over her handwriting. "Thank you," he managed, "for keeping it safe, for knowing when I'd be ready." Maggie's hand touched his arm briefly. She was a wonderful cook, and more than that, she was generous with what she knew. Taught me things that made my saloon's food worth eating. I've been using her recipes all these years, feeding half the town with her wisdom. The thought settled warm in Amos's chest. Sarah's legacy, continuing in ways he'd never known. Her kindness multiplied through Maggie's hands, nourishing a community that had been theirs. That evening, Amos sat at his small table, Hope at his feet, and went through the book page by page. Each recipe was a memory, Sunday roasts that had filled their cabin with mouth-watering smells, stews that had warmed cold winter nights, pies that Emily had helped make, her small hands covered in flour as she'd laughed. He found the recipe for Sarah's famous beef stew, the one she'd make for special occasions or when someone in town was sick or grieving. She'd always said food was how you showed love, when words weren't enough. On impulse, or maybe it wasn't impulse, maybe it was something deeper. Something about honoring Sarah's memory by living it, rather than just mourning it. Amos decided to make the stew. He hadn't cooked anything substantial since before the fire. Hadn't trusted himself with the memories that cooking would invoke. But now, with Hope watching curiously and the evening light streaming through his window, he began gathering ingredients. The butcher was surprised when Amos requested specific cuts of beef. Henderson raised an eyebrow when Amos asked to borrow vegetables from his garden. But both men provided what he needed without question, perhaps sensing this was important in ways Amos himself didn't fully understand. Back at the cabin, Amos laid out the ingredients and opened Sarah's book to the stew page. Her handwriting guided him. Brown the meat first, add the vegetables in stages, let it simmer low and slow, add the herbs at the end. Simple instructions, but behind them was a lifetime of care and practice. Hope supervised from her blanket, occasionally getting up to sniff at interesting smells, tail-wagging approval. Cooking filled the cabin with warmth and scent, transforming the space from a place of mere survival into something that felt like a home. As the stew simmered, Amos found himself talking to Sarah again, something he'd been doing more often lately. Not the desperate, guilt-ridden monologues of early grief, but casual conversation, as if she were just in the next room. "I'm using less salt than you did," he told her. "Henderson's got pressure in his blood," Doc says. "And I'm adding an extra carrot. Hope seems to like them." He smiled at his own words, at the absurdity and rightness of cooking for a dog while channeling his dead wife's recipes. When the stew was ready, rich and fragrant, looking exactly like Sarah's had, Amos had another impulse. He couldn't eat all this alone. Didn't want to eat it alone. Sarah's food had always been meant for sharing, for bringing people together. He divided the stew into containers Henderson provided, keeping some for himself and Hope. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he set out into town with an invitation. He found Sheriff Braddock at his office, Henderson closing up the livery, Doc Winters finishing his evening rounds, and Maggie locking up the saloon. To each, he offered a simple invitation: made some stew. Sarah's recipe. Would appreciate the company for dinner, if you're free. The surprise on their faces was worth the vulnerability of asking. They all accepted, and within an hour, Amos's small cabin was fuller than it had been since before the fire. He'd set out Sarah's good plates, the ones he'd kept wrapped in cloth, never able to bring himself to use them. He'd cleaned his table until it shone. He'd arranged chairs borrowed from Henderson. Hope, sensing something special was happening, stayed on her best behavior. Though her tail never stopped wagging at having so many people in her home, they gathered around the table, 5 people and 1 dog, and for a moment no one spoke. Then Henderson raised his glass of water. "To Sarah," he said simply, "and to Amos, for remembering that her love was meant to be shared." "To Sarah," the others echoed, and Amos felt his throat go tight. The stew was good, not quite as perfect as Sarah's had been, but close enough to evoke memory without being painful. The conversation flowed easily, helped along by Maggie's natural warmth and Braddock's dry humor. Doc told stories about Sarah's kindness to his patients over the years. Henderson shared memories of Emily playing in the stable while Amos worked. For the first time, Amos could talk about them without feeling like he was drowning. He shared stories of his own, funny moments, tender moments, the ordinary magic of daily life with people you loved. Hope got scraps from everyone, her presence a reminder that life continued, that new love didn't diminish old love. As plates emptied and conversation deepened, it inevitably turned to the railroad situation. "Preston's been busy," Braddock said, his jovial mood sobering. "He's got meetings scheduled with most of the major landowners. Heard he's been asking specifically about properties along the route, including yours, Amos," Doc added quietly. Amos nodded. He'd been ignoring Preston's messages, the polite notes requesting meetings. "Not interested in selling. He's persistent," Maggie said, her tone suggesting she knew from experience. "Came by the saloon 3 times, wanting to know who owned what, who might be persuaded to sell. Asked about you specifically, Amos. Seemed very interested in your property." Something cold settled in Amos's gut. "Why would he care about my place?" "I'm not on the rail route." The others exchanged glances. Henderson spoke carefully, actually looking at the maps he's shown. "Your property is a key junction point. The route bends around several larger ranches, and your land sits right where they'd need to put in a switching station or some such. He may have downplayed it in public meetings, but privately he needs your cooperation. Amos absorbed this, understanding dawning. Preston's interest in him at the town meeting hadn't just been about him swaying opinion. It had been about Amos being a direct obstacle to his plans. "What will you do?" Jesse asked, having arrived late after his patrol shift. Amos thought of Sarah, of the life they'd built here. He thought of Hope, found as an unwanted thing and given a home. He thought of Emily's laughter in the yard outside, of the graves on the hill, of the community that had given him space to grieve and time to heal. "This land is where my family lived," he said quietly. "Where they're buried. Where I found my way back to something like peace. Preston can make whatever offers he wants, but this land isn't for sale. He won't take no easily," Braddock warned. "Men like him, they're used to getting what they want. And they don't handle obstacles well." "Then he'll have to learn," Amos said, with more steel in his voice than he'd heard there in years. Maggie reached across the table, her hand covering his. "You're not alone in this. Whatever comes, this town stands with you." Looking around his table at these people who'd become something more than neighbors, who'd become friends, family, the support he'd thought he'd lost forever, Amos felt a surge of gratitude and determination. "Thank you," he said, and meant it more deeply than words could convey. They talked long into the evening, sharing concerns and strategies, but also sharing laughter and warmth and the comfortable fellowship of people who cared about each other. Hope moved from person to person, accepting pets and scraps. Her contentment, a reminder that sometimes the simplest things, food, company, shelter, love, were the most important. When everyone finally left, thanking him for the meal and the company, Amos cleaned up with a lightness in his chest he'd forgotten was possible. He'd cooked Sarah's recipe. He'd hosted friends in their home. He'd honored her memory by living, by connecting, by refusing to let grief be the only thing he carried forward. Hope settled on her blanket made from Sarah and Emily's clothes, and Amos sat beside her, running his hand over her soft fur. "We've got trouble coming," he told her quietly. "Preston isn't going to give up easily. But you know what? I think we're ready for it. I think—" He paused, the realization settling over him. "I think I'm ready to fight for something again." Hope's tail thumped against the floor, and in her trusting eyes, Amos saw reflected back the man he was becoming. Not the broken ghost he'd been, but someone stronger for having been broken and choosing to heal. Someone worth being. Someone Sarah would recognize. Outside, in the darkness beyond his cabin, Garrett Preston sat on his horse, watching the warm light in Amos's windows finally extinguish. He'd observed the comings and goings, noted who Amos's friends were, assessed the bonds being formed. Obstacles could be removed. The question was simply how much pressure needed to be applied. Preston smiled to himself and turned his horse back toward town. He had work to do. The envelope appeared under Amos's door on a Tuesday morning, sliding into his cabin so quietly that only Hope's sudden alertness made him aware of it. She'd been dozing on her blanket, but her head snapped up, ears forward. A low sound in her throat that wasn't quite a growl, but suggested concern. Amos was pulling on his boots, preparing for the day's work, when he noticed Hope's attention fixed on the door. He rose, opened it, and looked out to see nothing but the empty pre-dawn darkness. No footsteps, no horse, no sign of who delivered what lay on his floor. A plain manila envelope, unsealed, thick with what felt like papers inside. No name, no marking, just the envelope itself. Something about it made Amos's instincts flare, the same instincts that had kept him alive during his years as a marshal. Instincts that had lain dormant, but not dead during his decade of grief. This wasn't a social call or a business inquiry. This was information someone wanted him to have, but didn't want traced back to them. He carried the envelope to his table, lit the lamp even though dawn was breaking, and carefully pulled out the contents. What he found made his blood run cold. Newspaper clippings yellowed with age. The first from a town called Cedar Springs, dated 8 years back. Mysterious fire claims 2. Property sold to railway concern. Another from Willow Creek 6 years ago. Family perishes in blaze. Land acquired for rail expansion. A third from Blackrock 4 years past. Similar story, similar outcome. And then the dates and locations started becoming more recent, more frequent. Always the same pattern. Fires in small towns along proposed railway routes. Fires that struck properties of landowners who'd refused to sell. Fires that were ruled accidental but led to land changing hands. Amos's hands trembled as he spread the clippings across his table. 10 years of articles, dozens of fires, all connected to towns where the Denver and Santa Fe Railway Company, or its predecessor companies under different names but the same ownership, wanted to expand. But it was the handwritten note, on plain paper with no identifying marks, that made Amos's chest constrict until he could barely breathe. Mr. Briggs, 10 years ago, your property was wanted for a different rail route that was ultimately abandoned. You were asked to sell. You declined, too happy with your family to care about money. 2 weeks after you refused, your home burned. The fire was ruled accidental. Your wife and daughter died. Within a month, you received a charitable offer for your land. You refused that too, though you were too broken to understand what you were refusing. The pattern is clear to anyone who looks. The same company, the same methods, the same outcome. Now they want your land again, and they won't take no for an answer. History may repeat itself. Protect what you love. A concerned citizen. Amos read the note 3 times, each reading making his hands shake harder. Memories flooded back, memories he'd buried because they hurt too much to examine. He had been asked to sell 10 years ago. A man in a suit, representing some railway expansion company, had come to their cabin, offered a generous price for land that Amos had never intended to sell. The land where he and Sarah had built their life, where Emily played in the yard, where they'd planned to grow old together. He'd declined politely, firmly. The man had pressed, his politeness fraying around the edges. Amos had asked him to leave. The man had said something that Amos had dismissed at the time, but now echoed ominously in memory. I hope you don't come to regret that decision. 2 weeks later, the fire. At the time, grief had been so overwhelming that Amos hadn't questioned the investigation's conclusions. An accident, a knocked-over lamp, tragedy. He'd been too destroyed to consider anything else, too consumed by guilt for not being there to even wonder if there might be another explanation. But now, looking at these clippings, seeing the pattern laid out before him, had Sarah and Emily been murdered? Had they died not because of some random accident, not because Amos had failed to maintain their home properly, but because someone had deliberately set that fire to force his hand? The rage that rose in Amos was unlike anything he'd felt in a decade. Not the cold numbness of grief, not the dull ache of loss, but hot, focused fury. If this was true, if someone had killed his family over land, over money, over a railroad route, Hope whined, sensing his distress. She pressed against his leg, her warmth and weight anchoring him. Amos forced himself to breathe, to think, to not let rage cloud his judgment. He'd learned long ago as a marshal that anger made you stupid, made you miss details. He looked at the clippings again, forcing himself to read them as evidence rather than emotional triggers. The pattern was undeniable, but patterns weren't proof. He needed more. He gathered the papers, tucked them carefully into his coat, and headed into town as soon as the sun was fully up. Hope trotted beside him, her presence keeping him grounded when he wanted to rage. Sheriff Braddock was at his desk, coffee steaming beside him, when Amos burst through the door. The lawman took one look at Amos's face and immediately stood. What happened? Amos spread the clippings and note across Braddock's desk. Someone left this under my door this morning. No signature, no trace of who delivered it. Braddock read through the materials, his expression darkening with each article. When he finished, he sat down heavily, looking older than he had moments before. Lord have mercy, he breathed. Amos, if this is true, we need to know if it's true. The fire 10 years ago. The investigation. What do you remember? Braddock pulled out old files, hands moving with the careful precision of a man who understood he was handling potential evidence in a murder case. He found the fire report from a decade ago, spread it on his desk. It was ruled accidental, Braddock said, reading through his own notes. Lamp found knocked over, oil spilled, fire spread quickly. The investigator... He paused. Actually, now that I think about it, the investigator wasn't local. Territorial authority sent someone, said our resources weren't sufficient. Man named Sutton. Henry Sutton. Amos felt something click into place. In one of the articles, a name had been mentioned, an investigator who'd ruled another suspicious fire accidental. H. Sutton, Tom, Amos said quietly. I need you to look into something. These other fires, the ones in these articles. See if you can find who investigated them. See if Sutton's name comes up. Already planning to. Braddock's jaw was set hard. And I'm going to look into this railway company. Who owns it? Who ran it 10 years ago? Whether there's any connection to Preston. Doc Winters arrived at the sheriff's office, summoned by a message Braddock sent. He read through the materials, his medical precision extending to the analysis of evidence. The burn patterns on Sarah and Emily, Doc said slowly, his voice heavy with the weight of memory. I noted at the time that they seemed unusual. The fire was hot, very hot, hotter than a typical lamp fire should burn. I mentioned it in my report, but the investigator dismissed it, said old structures burn unpredictably. But you didn't believe that, Amos said, hearing what Doc wasn't saying. I didn't know what to believe. It was just an odd detail. But combined with this, he gestured to the clippings, it suggests accelerant. Someone who knew how to make a fire burn fast and hot. Amos's hands clenched into fists. Hope pressed against him, and he forced his fingers to relax, to stroke her head, to use her calm presence to maintain his own control. Henderson appeared next, having been fetched by Jesse, who Braddock had sent running. The old livery owner listened to the theory forming, his weathered face grave. I remember something else, Henderson said slowly. Right after the fire, maybe a week or two later, you received an offer for your land. Charitable relief, they called it. From an unnamed benefactor. I turned it down, Amos said. Didn't even read the amount. Didn't care about anything then. But I saw the paperwork, Henderson continued. Filed it away in case you ever wanted it. Let me get it, he returned with a folder, dusty and forgotten. Inside was the offer, generous, far more than the land was worth. And at the bottom, in small print, the representing company, Western Expansion Associates. Braddock pulled out the articles again, checking names. Western Expansion Associates shows up here and here. Different name than Denver and Santa Fe, but cheap. He flipped through territorial records, registered to the same ownership group. They change names, but the owners stay constant. Jesse, who'd been reading over shoulders, suddenly pointed to a name in the ownership documents. Garrett Preston. He's listed as a regional director even back then. The room went silent. Everyone looked at each other, understanding the implications. Preston was involved 10 years ago, Amos said, his voice barely above a whisper. He was part of the company that wanted my land. And 2 weeks after I refused to sell, my family died. We don't have proof it was murder, Braddock cautioned, but his tone said he believed it was. Just pattern and coincidence. Pattern and coincidence have convicted men before, Amos said. His mind was working now, martial training kicking in despite the personal stakes. We need to investigate quietly, see if we can find Sutton, get him to talk. Look into Preston's other activities, see if there've been incidents in other towns. He's been meeting with landowners here, Maggie said from the doorway. No one had heard her enter, but she'd clearly been listening, making offers, applying pressure. The Jenkins family, their barn burned last week. They'd refused Preston's initial offer. After the fire, they accepted his second one, the Jenkins barn, Jesse said, understanding dawning. I investigated that. Seemed suspicious, but I couldn't prove anything. He's doing it again, Amos said, rage and grief warring in his voice. Right here, right now. Same pattern. And if we don't stop him, he didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. They all understood, Preston would continue. More fires. More deaths. More families destroyed in service of railway expansion and profit. Braddock stood, his hand dropping to his gun belt, not reaching for the weapon, just touching it, reminding himself of his authority and responsibility. All right, here's what we do. Amos, you need to be careful. If Preston suspects you know something, you could be in danger. Hope too. At her name, Hope's ears perked up. Amos's hand found her head, his need to protect her now mixed with the terrible knowledge of what he'd failed to protect before. I can send telegrams to these other towns, Braddock continued. See if their sheriffs remember anything suspicious. Can try to track down Sutton, though if he's corrupt, he'll have covered his tracks. Doc, you keep any medical records from 10 years ago? Everything, Doc confirmed. I never throw anything away. I can review my notes, see if there are details I missed or that might take on new meaning now. We need evidence, Amos said, his martial mind taking over from his emotional reaction. Pattern isn't proof. We need something concrete. A witness, documentation, something that ties Preston directly to arson or murder. He's careful, Maggie warned. Men like him don't leave obvious trails. But he's also arrogant. Arrogance makes people careless. Amos looked at the materials spread across Braddock's desk. 10 years of death and destruction, all in service of railroad expansion. Somewhere in this pattern was the truth about Sarah and Emily's deaths. Somewhere in Preston's arrogance was the mistake that would bring him down. We investigate, Amos said firmly. Carefully, quietly, but thoroughly. And we protect this town. No more fires, no more deaths. And when we have proof, Jesse asked, then we bring him to justice, Braddock said. Legal justice, proper justice. Not vigilante revenge. He looked at Amos meaningfully, and Amos nodded. He wanted Preston to pay, wanted it with every fiber of his being. But Sarah had believed in law and order, in doing things right even when it was harder. He'd honor her memory by doing this properly. One more thing, Doc said quietly. Whoever sent you that envelope, they're taking a risk. They know something. Maybe work for Preston, maybe just noticed the pattern. They're putting themselves in danger to warn you. Amos looked at the anonymous note again. Then we make sure their risk wasn't wasted. We stop Preston before he can hurt anyone else. As the group dispersed to begin their investigations, Amos stood alone in the sheriff's office with Hope at his feet. He pulled out Sarah's locket, opened it, looked at the faces of his wife and daughter. For 10 years, he'd carried guilt for their deaths. Now he knew, or strongly suspected, that guilt had been misplaced. They hadn't died because he'd failed. They died because a greedy man had wanted land more than he'd valued human life. The grief was still there, would always be there. But the guilt lifted, replaced by a different kind of responsibility. Not to prevent something that had already happened, but to ensure it never happened again. I'm going to stop him, Amos whispered to the photographs. I'm going to make sure what he did to you, what he did to us, doesn't happen to anyone else. I promise you that. Hope leaned against his leg, and Amos closed the locket. He'd found purpose in caring for an unwanted puppy. Now that purpose had expanded into something larger, protecting the innocent, pursuing justice, honoring his family's memory through action rather than just grief. Preston had awakened something in Amos that had been dormant for a decade. Not just the will to live, but the will to fight. And Amos Briggs, former U.S. Marshal, had been very good at fighting when it mattered. The investigation took shape over the following days, with the careful precision of men who understood that one misstep could mean the difference between justice and failure. Amos threw himself into it with an intensity that surprised even those who'd watched him heal over the past months. What they didn't know, what he hadn't shared with anyone except Jesse in passing, was that Amos Briggs hadn't always been just a cowboy working in a livery stable. That evening, after another long day of gathering evidence, Amos sat his closest allies down in Braddock's office. Hope lay at his feet, her presence grounding him as he prepared to reveal a part of himself he'd kept hidden for 20 years. There's something you all need to know, Amos began, his hands folded on the desk. Before I married Sarah, before I settled in Redemption Flats, I was a United States Marshal. The statement hung in the air. Henderson's eyebrows rose. Doc leaned forward with interest. Braddock's expression shifted from surprise to understanding. Suddenly, things about Amos made more sense. "I served for 12 years, Amos continued, his voice steady despite the weight of memory. "Worked mostly in the territories, tracking down fugitives, investigating crimes that crossed jurisdictional lines. I was good at it. Maybe too good. I saw things, did things, that eventually I needed to walk away from." He pulled a small wooden box from his coat pocket, one he'd retrieved from his cabin that morning. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a tarnished silver badge. The 5-pointed star with U.S. Marshal engraved across it caught the lamplight as he set it on the desk. "I met Sarah while on an assignment in Santa Fe. She was—" He paused. The memory sweet and painful. She was everything the badge life wasn't. Gentle, hopeful, full of light. She made me want to be something other than a man who tracked criminals for a living. So I turned in my commission, married her, and tried to be just Amos Briggs, husband and father. "But you kept the badge," Braddock observed. "Couldn't quite let it go." Sarah knew about my past, accepted it as part of who I'd been. But we agreed that life was behind me. I was determined to be a better man for her and Emily. Amos's fingers traced the badge's edge. "After they died, I couldn't look at this. It reminded me of the skills I'd had, skills that should have protected my family but didn't. I buried it away, just like I buried everything else. But now?" Maggie asked gently. "Now I understand those skills might be exactly what we need to stop Preston. I know how to investigate, how to build a case, how to read criminals and predict their moves. And I have contacts. Other marshals, judges, people in positions to help if we can give them enough evidence." Over the next hour, Amos laid out a strategy born from years of experience. He'd already sent telegrams to former colleagues using careful language that wouldn't alert Preston if someone was monitoring communications. He'd requested information about Preston's past activities, about similar cases in other territories, about any existing investigations into railway company practices. "The pattern is clear," Amos explained, spreading documents across the desk. "Preston's company identifies land they need. They make an offer. If refused, accidents start happening. Fires mostly, but also livestock deaths, crop failures, anything to financially pressure the landowner. Eventually people sell, usually for less than the original offer, and if they still refuse—" Jesse asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Then the accidents become fatal." Amos's voice was flat, controlled rage simmering beneath professional calm. "I've confirmed 5 definite cases where holdout landowners died in fires after refusing to sell. Sarah and Emily were likely victims 6 and 7. The Jenkins barn last week suggests he's following the same pattern here." Braddock had been corresponding with sheriffs in other towns. Several remembered the cases, remembered the slick investigator named Sutton who'd ruled everything accidental, remembered feeling like something was wrong but lacking proof. "I found Sutton," Braddock said grimly. "Or rather, found where he was. He died 6 months ago in a fall from a hotel window. Ruled accidental, but the timing is suspicious. Right after one of the towns he'd covered for Preston started asking questions about reopening old cases. Preston cleaning up loose ends," Amos said. "It was a familiar pattern from his marshal days. Criminals eliminating anyone who could testify against them. Doc had reviewed his medical records from 10 years ago, finding details that hadn't seemed significant at the time, but now formed part of a larger picture. The burn patterns, the unusual heat of the fire, the fact that Sarah and Emily had been overcome by smoke unusually quickly, suggesting the fire had spread faster than a simple lamp accident should have caused. It's not conclusive, Doc admitted, but combined with everything else, it builds a strong circumstantial case. Circumstantial won't convict him, Amos said, his martial experience showing. We need something concrete. Either direct evidence linking him to the fires or a confession. How do we get either? Henderson asked. Amos had been thinking about this, his old investigative instincts awakening. Preston's arrogant. He's gotten away with this for years, and that's made him careless. He thinks he's dealing with simple townfolk who won't recognize his pattern. He doesn't know I used to do this for a living, so we use that against him, Braddock said, understanding dawning. Exactly. Preston has been trying to meet with me for weeks. I've been avoiding him, but now I think it's time to accept. Let him make his pitch, see what he reveals. I can draw him out, get him talking. Men like him, they like to brag about how clever they are, especially when they think they're in control. That's dangerous, Maggie said, worry evident in her voice. If he suspects you're investigating him, then we make sure he doesn't suspect, Amos interrupted gently. I play the grieving widower who's finally ready to move on, who needs the money from selling his land. Let him think he's won. You'll need backup, Braddock insisted. Someone positioned to intervene if things go wrong. Jesse can watch from outside. And Amos looked down at Hope, who'd been following the conversation with alert attention. Hope stays with Doc during the meeting. If Preston realizes she matters to me, he might use that as leverage or threat. Hope whined softly, sensing she was being discussed. Amos scratched behind her ears, drawing comfort from her presence, even as he planned to temporarily separate from her for safety. They spent the next several days preparing. Amos sent a carefully worded message to Preston, indicating willingness to discuss the land sale. Preston responded immediately, proposing a meeting at Amos's cabin, private, away from town eyes. Amos agreed, despite the danger of meeting on isolated ground. His cabin was where Sarah and Emily had lived, where they'd been killed. If Preston was going to confess to anything, facing those ghosts might rattle him enough to slip. Jesse practiced positioning himself outside the cabin's window, where he could hear everything but remain unseen. Braddock prepared to be close by, ready to move if needed. Doc agreed to keep Hope at his office during the meeting, though the dog clearly didn't like the plan. The night before the scheduled meeting, Amos couldn't sleep. He sat on his porch, the marshal badge heavy in his hand, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Hope sat beside him, her head resting on his knee, as if she knew something significant was coming. Maggie found him there. She'd developed a habit of checking on him in the evenings, their friendship deepening into something that felt like it might become more, given time. She sat beside him without asking, her shoulder touching his in companionable silence. "You don't have to do this," she said eventually. "We could bring in federal marshals, let them handle it." "That would take months," Amos replied. And in the meantime, Preston continues. "Someone else's barn burns. Someone else's family dies. I can't," his voice caught. "I can't let that happen if I have the power to stop it. Sarah would be worried about you taking this risk. Sarah would understand why I have to." Amos turned the badge over in his hands. "She knew who I was before I met her, knew I had this in me. She loved me anyway, maybe because she understood that sometimes good men have to stand against bad ones." Maggie took his hand, her fingers warm against his. "Just promise me you'll be careful, that you'll come back. You've finally started living again, Amos. Don't throw that away for revenge." "It's not revenge," Amos said, though he knew that wasn't entirely true. "It's justice and protection." And he paused, searching for the right words. "And maybe it's about proving to myself that I can be the man Sarah believed I was. The one who protects people instead of just surviving while they suffer." He looked at Hope, whose trusting eyes watched him in the darkness. This dog, this abandoned, wounded creature, had taught him that healing was possible, had shown him that caring about something was worth the risk of loss. Now it was his turn to protect others the way he'd protected her, to use the skills he'd thought buried forever to ensure Preston never destroyed another family. "I have to do this," Amos said simply. "Not just for Sarah and Emily, but for everyone Preston's hurt, and everyone he might hurt if we don't stop him." Maggie nodded slowly, understanding even as she worried. "Then we'll all be praying for you, and we'll be ready if you need us." After she left, Amos stayed on the porch with Hope, running through scenarios in his mind. He'd conducted hundreds of interrogations as a marshal, knew how to read people, how to push the right buttons to get them talking. But he'd never done it with such personal stakes before. Tomorrow, he'd face the man who'd likely murdered his family. He'd have to control his rage, maintain his cover, and somehow get Preston to reveal enough to ensure conviction, all while knowing that one wrong word, one suspicious reaction could endanger not just himself, but everyone he'd come to care about again. He pulled out Sarah's locket, opened it to the familiar faces. "Help me do this right," he whispered. "Help me be the man you believed I could be." Hope pressed closer against his leg, and Amos drew strength from her simple faith. She'd trusted him when she had every reason not to. She'd healed because he'd cared for her. Now it was time to care for his community, his town, his people. Time to be the marshal again, at least for one more case. Time to ensure that Garrett Preston faced justice for every life he'd destroyed. Inside his cabin, Amos prepared methodically. He cleaned his old revolver, kept oiled and functional out of habit, but unused for years. Not because he expected violence, but because preparation meant survival. He reviewed everything they knew, memorizing details, preparing questions that would seem innocent, but lead Preston toward revelation. He laid out clothes for the morning, fed Hope her dinner, and finally allowed himself to rest. Sleep came easier than he'd expected. His dreams filled not with nightmares of fire, but with memories of Sarah's laugh and Emily's joy. And when he woke to pre-dawn light, Hope already alert beside him, Amos Briggs felt something he hadn't felt in 10 years. He felt ready for confrontation, for truth, for whatever justice looked like when it finally arrived. The marshal badge sat on his nightstand, catching the morning light. Amos picked it up, turned it over one last time, then pinned it inside his vest where no one could see it. He was still Amos Briggs, cowboy, widower, dog owner. But today, he'd also be what he'd once been, a man who stood between the innocent and those who'd harmed them. Today, Garrett Preston would learn that some ghosts had teeth, and some old lawmen never really stopped being lawmen, no matter how long they'd been dormant. Hope barked once, as if in agreement, and Amos smiled despite the tension coiling in his chest. "All right, girl," he said, scratching her ears one last time before they'd have to separate. "Let's go finish this." The day of reckoning had arrived. Preston arrived precisely at the agreed time, his carriage rolling up to Amos's cabin with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. But he didn't come alone. 2 men accompanied him, hard-faced individuals with the look of hired muscle, guns visible on their hips. An intimidation tactic Amos recognized immediately. Preston wanted him nervous, off balance, eager to accept whatever deal was offered just to make the threat go away. Amos stood on his porch, hands relaxed at his sides, projecting nothing but calm acceptance. Hope was safely with Doc Winters, though leaving her had been harder than he'd expected. Jesse was positioned outside, hidden but listening. Braddock waited a quarter-mile away, ready to move at the first sign of trouble. "Mr. Briggs," Preston called out cheerfully as he dismounted. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. I think you'll find today very productive, Mr. Preston." Amos gestured toward his cabin. "Come inside. We can talk properly." Preston entered first, his confidence palpable, while his 2 men positioned themselves near the door, ostensibly casual, but clearly blocking the exit. Amos noted their positions with the automatic assessment of his martial training. Both were armed, both were alert. Neither looked particularly intelligent, which meant they'd follow Preston's orders without question. "I appreciate you finally agreeing to hear my proposition," Preston said, settling into Amos's chair without being invited. Another dominance move, claiming space that wasn't his. "I know you've been resistant, but I think once you hear the figures I'm prepared to offer, you'll see the wisdom of cooperation." Amos remained standing, keeping his own chair between himself and Preston. "I'm listening." Preston pulled papers from his case, spreading them on the small table with the flourish of a man revealing a winning hand. $5,000 for your property. That's triple its assessed value, Mr. Briggs. More money than a man like you could earn in a decade of work." "Generous," Amos said neutrally. "Very generous. Especially considering," Preston's smile took on an edge, "the property has certain liabilities. Tragic history. Some might say it's cursed. The fire that killed your family, that sort of thing, tends to lower value. I'm offering to overlook that." Amos felt rage flare hot in his chest, but kept his expression neutral. Preston was testing him, seeing if mentioning Sarah and Emily would provoke a reaction. Why do you want it so badly? The railway needs a junction point. Your land is perfectly positioned. We've been willing to root around other properties, make compromises, but yours is essential to our plans. Preston leaned back, confidence radiating from him. I'm a patient man, Mr. Briggs, but my patience has limits, and if I decline your generous offer... Preston's smile thinned. That would be unfortunate. You see, men who stand in the way of progress tend to experience setbacks. Bad luck, you might say. Fires, accidents, the sort of tragedies that might strike anywhere at any time. Like the Jenkins barn last week? Exactly like that. Preston's eyes glittered, and Amos saw the arrogance there, the absolute certainty that he was untouchable. Mr. Jenkins learned the wisdom of cooperation. I hope you're equally wise. Amos let silence stretch, watching Preston carefully. The man was practically vibrating with the need to demonstrate his power, to make Amos understand how thoroughly outmatched he was. Men like Preston, in Amos's experience, couldn't resist showing off their cleverness. You've done this before, Amos said quietly. Other towns, other properties. Preston laughed, actually laughed. Of course. This is business, Mr. Briggs. The railroad doesn't expand through politeness and hope. Sometimes obstacles need to be removed. He reached into his case again, pulling out a leather-bound ledger. This was what Amos had been hoping for, Preston's arrogance leading him to reveal too much. The man actually wanted to prove how powerful he was, how thoroughly he controlled the situation. This, Preston said, tapping the ledger, represents every property I've acquired over the past decade. Every obstacle overcome. Every necessary measure taken to ensure success. You see, I believe in documentation, in knowing exactly what investments yielded what returns. He opened the ledger, flipping through pages filled with neat entries, dates, locations, amounts paid, and in some cases, notes that made Amos's blood run cold, even as his martial training catalogued potential evidence. Cedar Springs, stubborn farmer, required encouragement. Preston read casually. Willow Creek, family more reasonable after proper motivation. He flipped more pages. Ah, here's one you might recognize. Amos forced himself to breathe steadily as Preston turned the ledger toward him. There, in precise handwriting, was an entry dated 10 years ago. Redemption Flats area, Briggs property. And beneath it, payment to H. Sutton, $500, investigation and acquisition support. You see, Preston said, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction, I've been interested in your land for a very long time. We had a different route planned then, but you refused my predecessor's offer. That was disappointing. So you had my family killed. Amos's voice was flat, deadly calm. Preston tilted his head, considering. I prefer to think of it as removing an obstacle. Your wife and daughter were unfortunate collateral, but business requires difficult decisions. The fire should have convinced you to sell. Instead, you became too grief-stricken to be reasonable. We had to abandon that route and wait. He leaned forward, his smile cold. But now we're back. And this time I'm not taking no for an answer. You've gotten attached to things again, I understand. That mongrel dog, for instance. It would be a shame if something happened to her. If history repeated itself. Something in Amos's expression must have changed because Preston's smile widened. There it is. That's what I needed to see. You care about something again, which means you have something to lose. So here's my final offer, $5,000, and the dog lives. Refuse and I can't guarantee her safety. Or yours. The two hired men shifted, hands moving closer to their guns. Preston sat back, confident he'd won, that Amos would cave under the threat to hope just as surely as he'd been destroyed by the loss of his family. Amos stood very still, feeling the weight of the marshal badge inside his vest, hearing Jesse outside the window listening to every word, knowing Braddock was close enough to arrive within minutes, understanding that Preston had just confessed to murder, to arson, to conspiracy, all recorded in the ledger sitting on the table between them. He thought of Sarah, of Emily, of 10 years of grief that had been manufactured by this man's greed. He thought of Hope, innocent and trusting. He thought of the Jenkins family and all the others Preston had terrorized, and Amos Briggs made his decision. He reached inside his vest and pulled out the marshal badge, setting it on the table beside Preston's ledger. "Garrett Preston," Amos said, his voice carrying the authority of 12 years, enforcing federal law. "You're under arrest for murder, arson, conspiracy, and about a dozen other charges I'm going to enjoy listing." Preston's confident smile froze. His eyes dropped to the badge, then shot back to Amos's face. "You're a United States Marshal, or was, officially. But I still know how to conduct an investigation, how to build a case, how to get arrogant men to confess their crimes because they can't resist bragging." Preston's face went pale, then red with rage. "You have nothing. This conversation means nothing without a witness." Amos gestured toward the window. "Deputy Martinez, you get all that?" "Every word," Jesse called from outside. Preston shot to his feet, hand reaching for the ledger. But Amos was faster, years of training and reflex taking over. His hand clamped down on Preston's wrist, while his other hand swept the ledger safely away. "Don't," Amos said quietly. Preston's 2 hired men moved, hands dropping to their guns. The first hired man drew fast, but Amos was already moving. Years might have passed since his martial days, but muscle memory ran deeper than time. He sidestepped, his hand catching the man's wrist and twisting with precise force. The gun clattered to the floor as the man yelped in pain. His arm bent at an angle that made resistance impossible. The second man had his weapon halfway out when the cabin door burst open and Jesse came through, his own gun drawn and steady. "I wouldn't," the young deputy said, his voice carrying surprising authority. "Drop it nice and slow." The man hesitated, calculating odds. Amos still held his partner in a control hold that would snap bone if he struggled. Jesse's aim never wavered. After a tense moment, the second man's gun joined the first on the floor. "Good choice," Amos said, releasing the first man but keeping himself positioned between both gunmen and Preston. "Jesse, secure them." Jesse moved with efficient precision, collecting weapons and producing handcuffs from his belt. Within moments, both hired men were restrained and seated against the wall, looking significantly less confident than when they'd arrived. Preston, meanwhile, had backed toward the rear door of the cabin, his composure cracking. "You can't do this. I have connections. The territorial governor judges, people who will bury this investigation before it even begins." "Maybe," Amos said, moving to block the only exit Preston could reach. "But that ledger tells a different story. And I've got connections too. Federal marshals who don't answer to territorial politics. Judges who've been looking for evidence of exactly this kind of corruption. It's your word against mine," Preston snarled, fear finally showing through his arrogance. A washed-up cowboy playing lawman. "No one will believe," Sheriff Braddock's voice came from the back entrance. "They'll believe the sheriff who heard every word through the window. Move away from that door, Preston." Preston spun to find Braddock entering through the back, gun drawn, expression grimmer than Amos had ever seen it. The railroad man was trapped, surrounded, his hired muscle neutralized, and his confession witnessed by multiple law enforcement officers. But cornered animals are the most dangerous. Preston's hand shot to his vest, producing a small derringer that had been hidden there, the kind of weapon desperate men carried for last resort situations. He aimed it at Amos, his hand shaking but finger tightening on the trigger. "I'm not going down for this," Preston said, voice cracking. "I'm walking out of here and none of you are going to stop me." Time seemed to slow. Amos saw Preston's finger beginning to squeeze, saw Jesse starting to move, heard Braddock shouting something. For a frozen moment, Amos thought he might finally join Sarah and Emily, thought perhaps that wouldn't be the worst way to go, having gotten justice for them first. Then a sound split the air. Not a gunshot, but a bark, sharp, urgent, protective, hope. She burst through the open front door like a brown and white storm, having somehow escaped from Doc Winters's office and tracked Amos through sheer determination. She'd heard the raised voices, sensed danger, and broken free to reach the person she loved most. The distraction broke Preston's focus. His head turned toward the sound, his aim wavering. Hope's sudden appearance reminded Amos of everything he had to lose now, everything worth fighting for. The derringer fired as Preston jerked in surprise, but the shot went wide, splintering wood beside Amos's head instead of finding its mark. Hope didn't attack viciously. That wasn't her nature. But she launched herself at Preston with the protective instinct of a creature defending her family. Her weight hit Preston's legs, knocking him off balance and sending him stumbling backward. The derringer flew from his hand as he crashed to the floor. Amos was on him in seconds, pinning him down with practiced efficiency. Jesse grabbed the derringer while Braddock produced more handcuffs. Within moments, Garrett Preston was restrained. Face down on Amos's cabin floor, his decade of crimes finally catching up with him. Hope stood over Amos protectively, her hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in her chest. Sunlight streaming through the window caught her collar. The name tag gleaming, Hope. Amos looked up at her, this dog who'd broken free to save him, and felt emotion surge through him so powerfully he could barely breathe. Good girl, he managed, his voice thick. Such a good girl. She immediately relaxed, tail wagging, licking his face with enthusiastic relief. Doc Winters appeared in the doorway, out of breath and apologetic. She was completely determined, Doc panted. Couldn't hold her. I'm sorry, don't be, Amos said, standing and embracing Hope, feeling her solid warmth against him. She might have just saved my life. Preston was shouting now, struggling against his restraints, threatening lawsuits and political consequences and everything his panic-stricken mind could conjure. But his voice was drowned out by the sound of more horses arriving. Amos had sent telegrams to former colleagues days ago. 3 federal marshals rode up to the cabin, men Amos had worked with years before. They took one look at the scene. Preston restrained, the ledger sitting on the table. Jesse and Braddock present as witnesses, and smiled with grim satisfaction. Amos Briggs, the lead marshal said, dismounting and offering his hand. Been a long time. Got your message. Looks like you've done our job for us, just preserved the evidence, Amos replied, shaking hands firmly. The rest is yours. The marshals took custody of Preston, ignoring his threats and protests. The ledger was secured as evidence, along with statements from everyone present. Preston's hired men, faced with federal charges, turned cooperative quickly, confirming details about fires set at Preston's orders. Payments made to corrupt officials, the entire network of crime that had funded railway expansion. As Preston was loaded into a wagon for transport to federal custody, the town began to emerge. Word had spread that something was happening at Amos's cabin. People gathered at a distance, watching as the man who'd been pressuring them was finally brought to justice. Henderson approached first, followed by Maggie, then others. They'd been waiting, worried, hoping. When they saw Amos standing unharmed, Hope at his side, relief washed over faces that had become dear to him. It's over, Amos told them simply. Preston confessed. The marshals have him. There won't be any more fires. Maggie's hand found his arm, squeezing gently. Henderson clapped him on the shoulder. Doc checked him for injuries, despite Amos's protest that he was fine. Jesse stood taller, proud of his role in bringing a criminal to justice. And through it all, Hope stayed pressed against Amos's leg, her presence anchoring him to this moment, this victory, this proof that sometimes justice actually prevailed. Later, after the crowd dispersed and official statements were given, Amos sat on his porch with Hope beside him. He pulled out Sarah's locket, opened it to those beloved faces. I know now, he told them quietly. It wasn't my fault. You were murdered. And for 10 years I blame myself for something I couldn't have prevented. But I can let that guilt go now. Can carry just the love instead. Hope's head rested on his knee, and Amos understood that his family would want this, would want him to heal, to connect, to protect others the way he wished he could have protected them. The grief would never fully leave. But it had made room for something else now, purpose, community, hope for the future. and for the first time in a decade, that felt like enough. 3 months had passed since that morning when federal marshals had taken Garrett Preston away in chains, and Redemption Flats had settled into something that felt like the peaceful aftermath of a storm survived together. Preston's trial had been swift. The ledger alone would have been damning, but combined with witness testimony, evidence from multiple jurisdictions, and the confessions of his hired men seeking reduced sentences, the verdict was never in doubt. Guilty on all counts, life imprisonment in a federal penitentiary, where men who'd hurt innocents for profit found justice of a different sort. The Denver and Santa Fe Railway Company, desperate to distance itself from Preston's crimes, had abandoned their expansion plans through Redemption Flats entirely. But another company, smaller, more principled, had approached the town 6 weeks later with a different proposal. A rail spur that would connect them to larger lines without requiring anyone to sell land or leave homes. Fair compensation for easements, local hiring for construction, and a binding agreement that preserved the town's character and decision-making authority. The town council, with input from every resident, had accepted. Progress would come, but on Redemption Flats' terms. The kind of balanced growth that Henderson had advocated for, that Sarah would have approved of. Amos's property, no longer needed for any rail expansion, had remained his. But he'd transformed it from a place of mere survival into something purposeful. The small cabin had been expanded slightly. Nothing grand, just enough room to be comfortable. The surrounding land had been fenced for a proper horse training facility, with Jesse's help in the construction. Young horses from throughout the territory were brought to Amos now, and his reputation as a trainer with uncommon skill had been restored and even enhanced. Jesse Martinez had become more than just a deputy who helped with horses. He worked at the ranch full-time now, learning everything Amos could teach him about training, about patience, about reading animals and people alike. The father-son dynamic that had been forming had solidified into something real and lasting. Jesse called him Pops now, unself-consciously, and Amos answered to it with a warmth he'd thought he'd never feel again. Maggie Chen had become a constant presence in Amos's life. They'd begun courting in the slow, proper way of people who'd both loved and lost before, who understood that second chances were precious and not to be rushed. She'd come for dinner twice a week, bringing food from the saloon and staying to help cook, to talk, to simply be present. They'd take evening walks with Hope trotting between them, conversation flowing easily about everything and nothing. It wasn't the passionate whirlwind of youth. It was something deeper, the steady comfort of two people who'd survived storms and found peace in each other's company. They hadn't discussed marriage yet, but the possibility hung in the air between them, comfortable and patient. Whatever they became to each other, it would happen in its own time. On this particular afternoon, Redemption Flats was celebrating its 50th anniversary as an incorporated town. The entire community had gathered in the town square. Families, old-timers who remembered the founding, children who represented the future. Reverend Phillips offered a blessing. Sheriff Braddock gave a speech about community resilience. Henderson, as the town's eldest resident, shared stories that made people laugh and remember. And then Doc Winters, who'd organized the celebration, announced that he'd arranged for a photographer to capture the moment. A traveling photographer had set up his equipment, his large camera mounted on a tripod, and invited everyone to gather for a town portrait. The crowd arranged itself with cheerful chaos, tall people in back, children in front, families clustering together. Amos found himself pulled to a spot near the center, Maggie taking her place beside him, her hands slipping naturally into his. Hope sat at their feet, perfectly behaved, her tail wagging slightly. Jesse stood just behind them, one hand on Amos's shoulder in an easy, affectionate gesture. Henderson, Doc, Braddock, all the people who'd become his family, surrounded them. The photographer ducked under his cloth, made final adjustments, and called for everyone to hold still and look pleasant. The moment stretched. 50 years of town history, and Amos Briggs somehow part of its fabric again, connected rather than isolated. needed rather than merely tolerated. The flash powder ignited with a pop and a puff of smoke, capturing them all together. A single moment that represented countless small moments of choosing community, choosing connection, choosing to keep living even when living was hard. After the photograph and the celebration, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Amos excused himself and rode out to the cemetery. He'd made this trip regularly over the past months, but today felt particularly important. The graves of Sarah and Emily sat beneath their oak tree, now shaded by fuller leaves. Amos dismounted, Hope jumping down to explore while staying close. He stood before the headstones, hat in his hands, feeling the familiar ache of loss mixed now with something else. Gratitude for what had been, and acceptance of what was. "We had our town celebration today," he told them, speaking aloud as had become his custom. 50 years of Redemption Flats standing strong. "I'm part of it again, really part of it. Thanks to Hope, thanks to good people, thanks to—" He paused. "Thanks to both of you never really leaving me, even when I thought I was alone." He knelt, placing fresh wildflowers on each grave. "Preston's in prison. Justice got served finally. I wish it brought you back, but at least it means no other families will suffer what we did. That has to count for something." Hope came and sat beside him, leaning against his leg in that way she had of offering comfort without words. Amos's hand found her head, fingers scratching behind her ears. "Maggie's been wonderful," he continued, smiling slightly. "I think you'd like her, Sarah. She's got your strength, your kindness. We're taking it slow, but it feels right. Not replacing what we had, but honoring it by letting myself be happy again. I hope that's okay." The wind rustled through the oak's leaves, and Amos chose to hear approval in that sound. Sarah would want him to live fully, to love again, to find joy where he could. He knew that with the certainty that comes from truly knowing another person's heart. "I'll keep visiting," Amos promised, standing. "Keep telling you about what's happening, about Hope's antics, about Jesse's progress, about everything. You're part of my story, always. But I'm ready to keep writing new chapters now. Hope that makes you proud." He touched each headstone gently, then returned to his horse. Hope trotted beside him as they rode back toward town, toward home, toward the life he'd rebuilt from ashes and grief and unexpected grace. Evening found Amos on his porch. Hope sprawled contentedly at his feet. Maggie arrived with 2 cups of coffee, settling into the chair beside him without needing an invitation. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in those colors Sarah had loved, oranges and purples, and that particular shade of pink she'd called blessing light. "Good day," Maggie said eventually, her voice soft. "Very good day," Amos agreed. Hope stirred, yawned hugely, then settled back to sleep with a contented sigh. Her collar gleamed in the fading light, the name tag catching the last rays of sun. Amos reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From the broken ghost he'd been to the man he was now. From finding an unwanted puppy in a crate to building a life that felt whole again. From numbness to feeling, from isolation to community, from merely surviving to actually living. Sometimes the smallest acts of mercy, stopping for a wounded creature, choosing to care when it would be easier not to, could change everything. Sometimes the most unwanted souls were the ones who saved you. Hope had needed him, but he'd needed her just as much. She'd given him reason to wake up, to connect, to fight for something beyond his own grief. She'd been the bridge that brought him back to life. Maggie's hand found his in the growing darkness, her fingers intertwining with his. Amos squeezed gently, grateful beyond words for second chances, for community, for love that came in different forms but was no less real for being unexpected. The stars emerged one by one above them, the same stars that had watched over his darkest nights, now witnesses to his healing. Hope snored softly, peaceful and safe. Maggie sat warm and solid beside him. Somewhere in town, Jesse was probably finishing his evening patrol. Doc was closing his office. Henderson was settling his horses for the night. Braddock was making his rounds. All the small rituals of a community that had held space for Amos until he was ready to fill it again. Amos looked down at Hope, then across at Maggie, Then up at the stars, where he imagined Sarah and Emily watching over him still. "Thank you," he whispered, "to all of them, to the universe, to whatever force had sent him hope when he'd needed her most. Life had broken him. Hope had helped him heal. And in healing, he'd found not just survival, but purpose, connection, and the courage to love again." The night wrapped around them, gentle and warm. 3 figures on a porch, man, woman, dog, together in the quiet peace of a day well-lived and a future full of possibility. Redemption, it turned out, came in many forms. Sometimes it wore fur and wagged its tail. Sometimes it arrived in the kindness of neighbors. Sometimes it meant choosing each morning to keep going, keep caring, keep hoping. And sometimes redemption meant understanding that the deepest wounds could heal without erasing the scars, that you could carry loss and love simultaneously, that moving forward didn't mean leaving behind. Hope stirred one last time, opening one eye to look at Amos. Her tail thumped twice against the porch boards. Then she settled back to sleep, content in the knowledge that she was home. She was safe, she was loved, and Amos Briggs, cowboy, widower, former marshal, dog owner, and twice blessed man, whispered into the peaceful night the truth he'd finally learned. "You saved me, girl. You saved us all."